Good day, students. Today, we would be discussing about causality or the idea of causation in history. The idea of causation is a very important factor in the understanding of historical methods and historical consciousness as a whole. Today, we would be discussing about the nature of causation as it is regarded in history, the impact that causation has had in the analysis of history over the course of the last 2 or 3 centuries, and we shall also be discussing the ways in which causation has been critiqued by different scholars, and we will also look at how causation has a relevance to the study of history in the present context and also for the future. Therefore, let us first turn to what we mean by causation. The cause and effect relationship, or causation in short, is not just a relevant idea and concept for history, but also for philosophy and the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and so on. Therefore, the idea that certain causes and certain relationships with their effects represent a certain mode of interaction is something which is not just valid for the humanities and the social sciences, but also for the natural sciences. So what do we mean by cause? A cause is actually something which is important to have created certain circumstances and events in a specific context of time and space. In a similar manner, effect is a term which tries to show certain factors which are consequent to these causes. Therefore, something is considered as an antecedent and another is considered as a consequent, and these two events have a relationship between each other. So causation as a theory and as a concept considers that there is a specific type of relationship between the cause and the effect. I would also like to state over here that causality or causation in general deals with a specific type of intuitive understanding of their relationship. This intuitive understanding is not out there in the nature. People have observed it, they have tried to look at it empirically and understood a certain form of relationship between the two. So these are almost verifiable. They are also recurrent phenomena. That is, if there is a cause, then there would be the similar effect or impact. And this technical understanding of a verifiable, predictable, and empirical analysis of cause and effect is what we understand by causation. In the technical sciences, this means that in a laboratory experiment, like particular objects being mixed with each other, chemicals being mixed with each other, would produce a similar impact wherever they are conducted. But this is the technical understanding. What is the meaning of causation in history? The notion of causation in history has been applied right from the ancient times. And even in history, we find that causation or an explanation of causes and impacts or effects is critical to the notion of historical understanding. It is actually a method of analyzing the past, giving a coherent shape to it, and also making it understandable. The past events make sense only when these are understood from the lens of causation. Without causation, history would merely be a mass of facts which are arranged almost sequentially to each other, but they do not convey any sense out of it. So causation makes it understandable, it makes it coherent for the reader, and it also makes us aware of how and why and through which means events happened in the past. As E.H. Carr had stated, we find that understanding history is always dependent on causation. So the historian and his relationship with the past depends on how he interprets the past on the basis of the materials which are available to him, and also trying to make sense of the data which is present in the past through his understanding of causation. So the essence of causation is to create a greater understanding of the past. And this is significant for us to remember. So as we know, history is a subject and a discipline which considers how, when, and what happened. So all of this are explained through an interpretation of causation. E.J. Tapp, in 1952, in an article, Some Aspects of Causation in History, made the bold statement that the concept of causation is inevitable for any history to be available. So he stated, the concept of causation, without a concept of causation, there can be no history. So it is the central pillar around which the historical discipline has been created and sustained. E.H. Carr, the famous historian, also tried to look at history as a study of causes. There are few who can reject the notion that causation gives us a complete understanding of the past. And there are also very few historians who would state that without an understanding of causation, there can be any history at all. So these are two interrelated aspects which one must remember. However, there is no single approach to causation which is there for the historian to adopt. And there are multiplicity of methods by which causation or the cause and effect relationship is established by the historian. And this is again an issue which is extremely contentious, a debatable issue. How to interpret the past, how to identify causes and their effects. So identification of a cause, a historical cause, is an extremely important phenomena which the historian needs to conduct on the basis of his analysis of the past data. However, we must understand that there is no single or monocausal causation which is usually applied by historians. There is always a multiplicity of factors which are dealt with by the historian in order to understand the past. So the cause and effect relationship is always placed within a set of different circumstances, different data sets which are present in the space and time of a certain period and a certain location. So the causal relationship or the causation as a whole is something which has been dealt with by historians in different ways. There are multiple factors which are at work over here. Sometimes historians have considered that there are necessary causes and there are sufficient conditions. So necessary and sufficient causes and necessary and sufficient conditions are defined in a manner whereby the necessary conditions mean that without these circumstances and conditions, a particular effect would not take place. Even necessary conditions are divided into two types. We have absolute conditions and we have relative conditions. Absolute conditions refer to those circumstances without which a particular happening would not happen. So, the absolute conditions define a certain event in a certain fashion. Relative conditions are those conditions with which we have a probable impact taking place. And these events may happen or may not happen, but the circumstances would be there. So, one factor is necessary conditions. But there is also another concept of sufficient conditions. And sufficient conditions usually refer to that particular set of circumstances with which a particular impact would always tend to happen. So, this is actually the way in which the historians have tried to construct the sequence of causes: necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. Now, causation, as we have already stated, means an interrelationship between different kinds of causes and their effects. Historians have usually defined these interrelationships in terms of various kinds of relations. We find that there are primary and secondary causes which have been identified by historians for several phenomena in history. There are also historians who have tried to look at central or core reasons and ephemeral reasons or minor reasons. There are also historians who have tried to look at long-term and immediate causes. So there are different shades of opinion which have been generated by historians in order to understand the past. There are also certain historians who have tried to identify single great causes in history. So these great causes would tend to create circumstances for definite events to happen. Causation, as we understand, is a method of knowledge making and explanation of history. On the basis of these causal relationships, we find that historians, and especially those who have dealt with the philosophy of history, tend to identify laws and patterns in history. As we have already heard or often hear, history repeats itself. This is a popular notion which tries to show that similar circumstances are available or they repeat itself in different times and different areas. So these are all issues which deal with the understanding of causation. Selection and identification of causes is one important area, but there is another area which is also significant, which is the subjective considerations which a particular historian has about the past. And these two are interconnected. E.H. Carr had stated that just as historians gather facts and discard the irrelevant facts, in a similar manner, the causal relationships also need to be identified carefully so that causes which are irrelevant may be weaned, may be pruned, and may be cut off from the analysis of history. So, a hierarchization of different kinds of causes need to be made consciously by the historian. The historian may use rational arguments based on his analysis of the past, or he may also use value judgments for understanding the past. But it is a combination of the two which usually enables the historian to interpret his analysis of the past. There are critics who have tried to show that the causes are not intrinsic. They do not have a value which is placed within it. It is only the historian who tries to look at these causes and tries to impose a value on them. So these causes are subjective and they are arbitrarily placed by historians. But there are also others who have tried to state that the causal interpretation, even if it is subjective in its nature, this is the interesting aspect of history without which the discipline would not exist. So there are different shades of opinions about causation. There are also other paradigms about causation. For instance, we find that Louis Gottschalk, in his Understanding History, a primer of historical method, tries to locate long and short-term causes. For him, we find that the historian must analyze the past events through the filter of causality, which is to be arranged in a hierarchical format. We also find the French Annales school of historians trying to look at the causes which stretch almost thousands of years. These are concepts of geographical understandings of history, of understanding weather patterns in a long-range format, and also demographic change may be analyzed by a historian in a very longer durée fashion. So the Annales school of historians have tried, for example, Fernand Braudel, in his famous book, The Mediterranean During the Age of Philip II, tried to analyze history and causes in history in very long-term analysis. There are also others who try to look at true causes, and these true causes are identified not just in the actions that individuals undertake, but they try to look at the psychological aspects, the intentions behind individuals undertaking such actions. And this is an area of psychohistory which has also been dealt with by certain historians. So true causes, the intentionality between the understanding of a historian about the factors which have happened in the past, this is a significant area as well. So if we look at the evolution of causation throughout history, then we would understand that despite the fact that causation is a new concept, new in the sense that it developed only from the 18th and the 19th century onwards in a modern historical method format, but historically causation, or the understanding of causes and their effects, is something which was there right from the ancient period onwards. And we find that it was prevalent even during the Greek and the Roman historical consciousness. In fact, we find that the narrative data, the analysis of different events in the past by Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Tacitus, and others, have tried to look at causes and effects in a very concerted manner right from the ancient times. So the causal relationship in these narrative histories are usually implicit. They are not always explicitly stated. The Greeks and the Romans, however, tried to look at the causal relationship not just from the human angle, that is, that the history is not made by humans alone. There was also the idea that divine interventions, the will of the gods, had a specific role to play in history. So fate and the will of gods, or providence, had been showcased by historians right from the ancient times. If we move on to the Middle Ages, then also we find that the medieval scholastics who tried to look at Christianity and its spread, the historical analysis of Christianity, as well as in the Arab world, where the Islamic historians tried to showcase the spread of Islam, they also attempted to look at history not just from the historical human-related conditions, but also from an analysis of divine will. So we find that teleological notions, that is, that history would take a definite framework, it would have its own path of progress. This is something which has been dealt with by the medieval scholars. St. Augustine's City of God, for instance, is an example of how the history and historical consciousness works between these two notions of man-made history and a divine providence working in tandem with each other. Nevertheless, we find that divine will remained a very important cornerstone of historical consciousness in the Middle Ages or the medieval times. From the 18th and the 19th century onwards, we find that with the emergence of history as a scientific discipline, the understanding of causation also underwent changes. It was only in the 18th century when we find that causation became an important segment of man-made factors. Baron de Montesquieu, the French philosopher and political scientist, in his Considerations on the Causes of the Grandeur and Decadence of the Romans, tried to emphasize on the causal factors in history. Montesquieu believed that, I quote, "It is not fortune that rules the world. There are general causes, whether moral or physical, which act upon every monarchy, which advance, maintain, or ruin it. All accidents are subject to these causes." And therefore, he tried to analyze how the general causes, the moral causes, and varied causes and their effects created a circumstance, or rather created the circumstances for history to progress. We find that after the 18th century, there were different kinds of notions which were forwarded by historians. Mechanical notions, biological notions, metaphysical notions, economic notions, and psychological notions for understanding causality and the cause and effect relationship. So the multiplicity of factors which was relevant for the discipline of history had been explained through different genres or different modes, as it were. We find that Montesquieu's understanding of the decline of the Roman Empire was also inherited in a certain manner by Edward Gibbon's famous The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In the 18th century, we find that different other ideas of historical causation also gained momentum. The idea of total, progressive, causal histories began to emerge in Germany under the leadership of Hegel, and also the understanding of positivist scientific methods of history under Leopold von Ranke also tried to look at the causal relationship in a different format. So empirical evidence and the understanding of different sets of evidence as the major foundation for the discipline of history became important from the 18th century onwards. We also find that in the 19th century, especially during the middle of the 19th century, the Marxist notion, which was given by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and others, tried to look at the history of humankind through a number of stages of development. The idea of historical materialism, that human societies have progressed from the primitive communist days till the present times in or under various subsets of causes, and their impacts has been analyzed by Marx. He tried to distinguish between modes of production and the factors of production, and he dealt with the type of relationship between several social classes on the basis of the idea of conflict between classes. So this is a form of economic understanding which was given by Marx, and Friedrich Engels in fact tried to claim that Marx had discovered the laws of history. However, critics tried to show that this was only an analysis of economic determinism. That is, that society developed only through certain methods, and without these methods, there could be no history, is something which was a form of economic determinism that was imposed by Marx and Engels. The English philosopher David Hume had also stated about the different areas of criticism about the causal relationship. There are no causes which are almost pre-existent. They are always existent within the imagination of the historian. So, these causal relationships cannot be proven, according to him. Social Darwinism in the late 19th century also provided a new method of understanding societal development through causal factors. There were others also who tried to look at history and causation in other ways. For example, Carl Gustav Hempel, in his 1942 study, The Function of General Laws in History, tried to state certain general conditions, general laws of history. However, this was rejected by most as being too naive and simplistic. A more recent method of understanding history and causes is through the counterfactual mode. The counterfactual mode or approach has been given by several historians in the 20th century. For example, Niall Ferguson, Robert Crawley, Richard Evans, and lately Catherine Gallagher, among others. Counterfactual history is also known as wishful or speculative history. It is also termed as possible worlds. Sometimes virtual or hypothetical history is also a term which is used for them. These approaches tried to look at how and what would have happened if certain causes did not take place. For example, if Napoleon had not been defeated in Russia, if the winter in Moscow had not defeated Napoleon, what would have happened? What would have happened if the colonizers, the British, had not left India in 1947? These are some of the hypothetical issues which are engaged by counterfactual historians in order to explore and give us an understanding of how methods and causal analysis can be challenged. So, Richard Evans's In Defense of History is a work which explores this in a variety of ways. So, this is something which is contentious, sometimes it is also controversial, but yet this is also a way in which causal relationships have been understood. History and causation also faced a challenge in the 20th century with the coming of the linguistic turn. And linguists, with the coming in of narrative history and the challenge towards history as a meta-narrative in the 20th century, we find that history was considered just like a fictional analysis, just like a novel, just like a story. So, we find that historians were regarded as scholars who tried to plot different events and tried to explain different factors in history from their understanding, the imaginative understanding of the past. And this imaginative understanding was critiqued by scholars like Hayden White, Keith Jenkins, and others. So we find that historical inevitability, the idea that free will can be exerted, or the analysis of chance events in history, these are certain aspects which have challenged the idea of causation. Whether causation actually inhibits a historian from analyzing the particular set of circumstances which existed in the past or not is something which historians need to tackle. So, determinism, in a certain sense, the idea that free will of people did not have a particular role to play, and whether individuals in the past were able to make their own choices, whether they were forced by the circumstances to act in a particular fashion, these need to be looked at by historians. So, these are contentious, debatable areas which have been identified by scholars of causation. We also find that the present condition in which history exists tries to analyze causation as a multiplicity of factors, and we also understand that historical consciousness enables the understanding of causation not just from the individual factual events which happened, but also the external influences which had a role to play on the historian. So, coming to conclusion, we can state that causation is one of the central significant notions of the understanding of history. It has been challenged by several quarters and several scholars, and despite this subjectivity, despite the analysis of different kinds of data on the basis of interpretations by historians, these are aspects which have enabled the historian to expand his idea of the past. So, the openness of the historian, the way in which he or she has been able to reassess history, and the possibilities that the causal relationships have given rise to, make the understanding of the discipline of history more and more significant. Thank you so much.